3 days. That's all it took for Emily Carter's fairy tale to unravel. 3 days after she said, "I do," she was dead. But this isn't just a story about a marriage gone wrong. It's about secrets buried deep in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Oregon. Secrets that someone was willing to kill for. Emily was the kind of woman who believed in second chances. She saw the good in people even when they didn't deserve it. Jake Thompson, her new husband, was charming, intense, and fiercely protective. But behind closed doors, that protectiveness turned into something darker. Something Emily couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. Their wedding day was perfect. At least that's what everyone thought. The sun shone over the lake, the guests laughed, and Emily's smile lit up the room. But if you looked closely, you might have noticed the way Jake's hand tightened around hers a little too firmly, or the way Emily's best friend, Megan, kept glancing at her with worry in her eyes. And then there was Lucas. He wasn't on the guest list. He wasn't even supposed to be in town. But there he was, standing at the edge of the woods, watching the ceremony like a ghost from Emily's past. No one knew why he was there, not yet. 3 days later, Emily was gone. The police called it a crime of passion. Jake called it an accident. But the truth was far more complicated. Because Emily had been keeping secrets of her own. Secrets that might have gotten her killed. This is the story of Emily Carter, Jake Thompson, and the lies that destroyed them. But it's also the story of what happens when love turns deadly, and when the people you trust the most are the ones you should fear. So what really happened in those 3 days? And who else was involved? Because one thing's for sure, Jake wasn't the only one with something to hide. The wedding day was everything Emily had dreamed of, almost. The small chapel in Willow Creek was filled with the soft glow of candlelight, and the scent of wildflowers hung in the air. Emily stood at the altar, radiant in a simple white dress, her eyes locked on Jake as he slipped the ring onto her finger. To everyone watching, it was a picture-perfect moment. But if you looked closer, you might have noticed the way Jake's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Jake had insisted on controlling every detail of the wedding. From the guest list to the music, he had an opinion about everything. Emily had brushed it off, chalking it up to his perfectionism. "He just wants everything to be perfect for us," she told her friends. But Megan, Emily's best friend since childhood, wasn't so sure. She'd seen the way Jake's temper flared when things didn't go his way. She'd heard the sharp edge in his voice when Emily disagreed with him. And now, as she watched Emily laugh and dance at the reception, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was during a quiet moment at the reception that Megan noticed the bruise. Emily had rolled up her sleeves to help set up the dessert table, and there it was, a faint purple mark circling her wrist. "What happened?" Megan asked, her voice low so no one else would hear. Emily hesitated for a moment before forcing a smile. "Oh, it's nothing," she said, pulling her sleeve back down. "I tripped while I was packing. You know how clumsy I am." But Megan wasn't convinced. She'd seen bruises like that before, and they didn't come from tripping. Still, she didn't push. Emily was happy, or at least she seemed to be, and Megan didn't want to ruin her best friend's wedding day. Later that evening, Emily's older brother, Daniel, pulled her aside. He'd been watching Jake all night, his expression growing darker with every passing hour. "Are you sure about this, Em?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I don't like the way he talks to you, the way he looks at you. It's like he thinks he owns you." Emily sighed, her smile faltering for the first time that day. "Jake's just stressed," she said, her voice pleading. "The wedding, work, it's a lot for him. He's not perfect, but he loves me, and I love him. That's all that matters, right?" Daniel didn't answer. He just hugged his sister tightly, his jaw clenched as he glanced over her shoulder at Jake, who was laughing with a group of friends across the room. Daniel didn't trust him, and he wasn't the only one. As the reception wound down, a figure stood at the edge of the property, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. Lucas. He hadn't been invited to the wedding. He hadn't even been in town for years. But there he was, watching Jake with an intensity that sent a chill down Megan's spine when she noticed him. She didn't know who he was, but the way he stared at Jake made her uneasy. Lucas was an old friend of Jake's, though friend might have been too generous a term. They'd grown up together, but their relationship had always been complicated. Lucas had disappeared years ago, leaving behind a trail of rumors and unanswered questions. And now he was back. Emily didn't see him that night. She was too caught up in the joy of her wedding, too focused on the life she was building with Jake. But Lucas was there, watching, waiting, and whatever he knew about Jake, it wasn't something he was willing to share. Not yet. As the night came to an end and the guests began to leave, Emily stood with Jake under the stars, her head resting on his shoulder. "This is the start of forever," she whispered, her voice filled with hope. Jake kissed her forehead, his arms tightening around her. "Forever," he echoed. But forever, as it turned out, was shorter than either of them could have imagined. And the cracks in their fairy tale were already beginning to show. Emily and Jake's love story began in the most ordinary of places, a small diner on the edge of Willow Creek. Emily had been sitting alone, sipping coffee after a long shift at the library, when Jake walked in. He was tall, with a disarming smile and a way of looking at her that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. He introduced himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but there was something else too, a vulnerability that drew her in. They talked for hours that night. Jake told her about his dreams of opening his own auto shop, about the music he loved, and about the childhood he rarely spoke of. His father had been a hard man, he said, and his mother had left when he was just a boy. "I don't want to be like him," Jake admitted, his voice low. "I want to be better." Emily believed him. She saw the pain in his eyes and the determination in his voice. She thought she could help him heal, that her love could be the thing that saved him. And for a while it seemed like it might. But there were moments, even in those early days, when Jake's intensity scared her. The way his mood could shift so suddenly, the way his eyes darkened when something didn't go his way. She told herself it was just his past catching up to him, that he was still learning how to trust. Their first fight came a few months into their relationship. Emily had been out for drinks with her coworkers after work, and Jake had shown up unannounced. He'd watched from across the bar as she laughed with a male colleague, his expression growing colder by the minute. When she finally noticed him, he was already halfway out the door. "Who was that?" he demanded as soon as they were alone. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Emily's stomach twist. "Just a coworker," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "We were celebrating a project. It was nothing." Jake didn't believe her. He accused her of flirting, of disrespecting their relationship. Emily tried to reason with him, but the more she defended herself, the angrier he became. Finally, he stormed out, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot. He didn't come home that night, or the next. Emily called and texted, her anxiety growing with every unanswered message. She barely slept, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. And then, on the third day, he came back. He was carrying a bouquet of wildflowers, his eyes red from what he said were tears. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "I just love you so much, and the thought of losing you, I can't handle it." Emily forgave him. Of course she did. She told herself it was just a misunderstanding, that Jake's fear of abandonment came from his troubled past. She believed him when he promised it would never happen again. But it did. The fights became more frequent, the accusations more cutting. Jake's temper flared over the smallest things. A text from a friend, a late night at work, a comment he took the wrong way. Each time he would disappear for a day or two, only to return with apologies and gifts. And each time, Emily forgave him, clinging to the hope that their love could overcome anything. But there was someone else who saw what was happening. Someone who knew Jake better than Emily ever could. A week before the wedding, Emily's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her answer. "Emily," the voice on the other end said. It was low, urgent. "This is Lucas, Jake's, an old friend. You need to listen to me." Emily froze. She'd heard Jake mention Lucas before, but only in passing. He'd always brushed it off, saying they'd lost touch years ago. "Don't marry him," Lucas said, his voice tight with emotion. "I know what he's like. I've seen what he can do. He's not the man you think he is." Emily's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "People change," she said, her voice firm. "Jake's not the same person you knew. He's worked hard to be better." Lucas hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There are things you don't know," he said finally. "Things he's hiding. Please just be careful." Emily hung up, her hands trembling. She told herself Lucas was just bitter, that he didn't understand the man Jake had become. But his words lingered in her mind. As the days passed, Emily tried to push the encounter from her mind. She told herself Lucas was just a ghost from Jake's past, someone who didn't understand the man he'd become. But deep down, she couldn't shake the unease his warning had stirred. And then, just 3 days after the wedding, everything changed. The first blow came when Jake lost his job. The marketing firm where he worked had been struggling for months, and when the owner announced a massive staff reduction, Jake was among the first to go. He came home that evening, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. "They let me go," he said, his voice flat, as though he couldn't quite believe it himself. Emily tried to comfort him, to reassure him that they'd figure it out, but Jake wasn't in the mood for comfort. He paced the living room, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I've given that place everything," he muttered, "and this is how they repay me." Emily stayed quiet, knowing better than to push him when he was like this. But as the hours passed, Jake's mood only grew darker. He snapped at her for little things, the way she stacked the dishes, the tone of her voice when she asked if he wanted dinner. She tried to stay calm, to give him space, but the tension in the house was suffocating. That night, while Jake slept, Emily reached for his phone. She told herself she was just checking for job listings, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the only reason. She'd noticed the way he'd been guarding it lately, the way he'd flinch whenever it buzzed. The messages from Claire were the first thing she saw. "You think you can just walk away?" One read, "I know what you did to me, and I'm not the only one." Emily's heart pounded as she scrolled through the conversation. Claire's words were sharp, accusing. She claimed Jake had abused her, that he'd left her with scars, both physical and emotional. "You're a monster," one message said, "and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Emily's hands shook as she put the phone down. She wanted to believe it wasn't true, that Claire was lying, but the doubt had already taken root. And when Jake woke up the next morning, she couldn't keep it to herself. "Who's Claire?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake froze, his expression hardening. "Where did you hear that name?" "I saw the messages," Emily said, her voice rising. "She says you hurt her. Is it true?" For a moment, Jake just stared at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. And then, without warning, he grabbed her arm, his grip so tight it made her gasp. "You went through my phone?" he snarled. "You think you have the right to spy on me?" Emily tried to pull away, but Jake's grip only tightened. "Let me go," she cried, but he didn't listen. Instead, he dragged her into the bedroom and shoved her inside, slamming the door behind her. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not until we talk." Emily's heart raced as she backed away from the door. She could hear Jake pacing outside, muttering to himself, and she knew she had to get out. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Megan's number. But before she could hit call, the door flew open. Jake was there, his face twisted with rage. He grabbed the phone from her hand and threw it against the wall, the screen shattering on impact. "You think you can call someone?" he shouted. "You think they'll believe you over me?" Emily tried to push past him, but he blocked her way, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. Outside, a neighbor heard the commotion. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But when the screams didn't stop, she picked up the phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, it was too late. The officers found Emily lying on the bedroom floor, her body still, her eyes wide and unseeing. Jake was kneeling beside her, his hands covered in blood, his face pale with shock. "It was an accident," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." But the officers weren't listening. They handcuffed him and led him out of the house, his protests fading into the night. As the police car pulled away, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Lucas. He stood at the edge of the property, his eyes fixed on the house, his expression unreadable. "I tried to warn her," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But it wasn't just Jake she should have been afraid of." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of questions that no one could answer. In a moment of rage, Jake had shattered everything. But as the pieces began to fall into place, one thing became clear. Jake wasn't the only one with secrets. And whatever Lucas knew, it was enough to change everything. The days following Emily's death were a blur of grief and disbelief. For Detective Sarah Mitchell, the case was personal. She'd seen too many women like Emily, bright, hopeful, and trapped in relationships that turned deadly. As she sat in her office, flipping through Emily's diary, she felt the weight of every word. The diary was a window into Emily's world, filled with moments of joy, fear, and quiet desperation. She wrote about Jake's charm, his promises, and the way he made her feel like she was the center of his universe. But there were other entries too, entries that made Sarah's stomach twist. "He grabbed my arm so hard it left a bruise," one entry read. "He said he was sorry, that he didn't mean to, but I can't stop thinking about the look in his eyes." Another entry, written just days before the wedding, was even more chilling. "Lucas called me. He told me not to marry Jake. He said Jake has a dark past, that he's not the man I think he is. I want to believe he's wrong, but what if he's not?" Sarah closed the diary, her mind racing. She needed to talk to Jake. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on Jake's face. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence replaced by a hollow emptiness. "Tell me what happened," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "It was an accident," he said finally. "We were arguing and she fell. I didn't mean to hurt her." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze steady. "The medical examiner says otherwise. The injuries don't match a fall. They match a blow from a heavy object." Jake's face paled, but he didn't respond. "And then there's Claire," Sarah continued, watching him closely. "She says you abused her too, that you left her with scars. Is that true?" Jake's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained calm. "Claire's lying. She's always been jealous of me. She's just trying to ruin my life." Sarah didn't believe him. She'd seen too many men like Jake, men who twisted the truth to fit their narrative. But she also knew that Jake wasn't the only one with secrets. The funeral was a quiet affair, held on a gray, overcast day. Emily's brother, Daniel, stood at the front of the small chapel, his face etched with pain. Megan stood beside him, her eyes red from crying. "She deserved so much more," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I should have done more to protect her." Megan nodded, her hand gripping his arm. "We all should have." As the service ended and the mourners began to disperse, a figure approached Megan. It was Lucas. He looked different now, older, more worn. But there was a determination in his eyes that made Megan pause. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen." Megan frowned, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows the truth," Lucas replied. He handed her a small USB drive. "This is what I wanted Emily to see." Before Megan could respond, Lucas turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her standing there, the USB drive clutched in her hand. Back at the station, Sarah continued to piece together the evidence. Jake's history of violence, the messages from Claire, the diary entries, it all pointed to a pattern of abuse. But there was something else too, something that didn't quite fit. Megan sat alone in her living room, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as she plugged it into her laptop, unsure of what she was about to see. The screen flickered to life, and within moments, she wished she hadn't looked. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Jake, younger but with the same cold eyes, stood over a woman named Rita. She was crying, pleading with him to stop, but he didn't. He hit her, over and over, his face twisted with a sickening mix of anger and satisfaction. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he picked up a camera and recorded it, his voice eerily calm as he narrated what he was doing. Megan's stomach turned as she scrolled through the files. There were more videos, Jake with another woman, Vanessa, who looked barely out of her teens. He abused her too, his methods chillingly similar. He recorded every moment, as if reliving it gave him some kind of twisted pleasure. And then there were the notes. Jake had kept a detailed log of his actions, documenting each encounter with a clinical detachment that made Megan's skin crawl. It was clear now Jake wasn't just an abuser. He was a predator, a serial offender who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Lucas had known. That's why he'd tried to warn Emily. That's why he'd disappeared all those years ago. He couldn't stand to be around Jake anymore. Megan didn't hesitate. She called Detective Sarah Mitchell and handed over the USB drive. The evidence was damning. Jake's history of violence, the videos, the notes. It all painted a picture of a man who had been terrorizing women for years. When confronted with the footage, Jake's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He tried to deny it at first, but the proof was undeniable. The trial was swift. Jake was sentenced to life in prison, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. But for Emily's family and friends, the victory felt hollow. Nothing could bring her back. At the courthouse, Megan stood with Daniel, both of them staring at the empty defendant's chair. "We did the right thing," Daniel said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But it doesn't feel like enough." Megan nodded, tears streaming down her face. Emily deserved better. They all did. Emily's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't in vain. Her story, and the stories of the other women Jake had hurt, served as a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence. It's a reminder to all of us, to recognize the signs, to speak up, and to take action. Love should never hurt. If you or someone you know is in danger, don't wait. Reach out to a trusted friend, a family member, or a domestic violence hotline. You are not alone. Thank you for watching. If the story moved you, please share it, like it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can raise awareness and help prevent tragedies like this from happening again.